Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on our cities and the Great Decarbonisation Challenge. Before we commence, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we meet today and pay respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. In my case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Quillin Nation. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today as well. Also, I'd like to thank the French-ANZ Chamber of Commerce for the organisation of this event, Schneider Electric, the sponsor of this forum, and the French Embassy, Australia, and sponsors for their support throughout. So to begin with, my name is Terence Jarretnam. I'm a partner at EY's Climate Change and Sustainability Practice based in Melbourne. I'm one of the 11 partners leading a team of around 200 people who work in environment, health and safety, climate change, sustainability, social impact, and sustainable supply chains. I'm delighted to have with us today on the panel, Louise Smith, who's the Vice President of Digital Buildings for Schneider Electric. Welcome, Louise. Anna Quillin, who's the Director, Development Delivery at ENGIE, or ENGIE in French. Mark Cleve, Transdev, Head of Engineering in Transdev at Australasia. And Rob Brimley at Monash University, who I know really well. Hi, Rob. So just, I guess, as an introduction, whether we talk of species loss, land degradation, climate change, or ocean plastics, the impacts continue to be exponential. So if we sort of start to look at any of those areas from 1950s to now, it's an exponential curve. But notwithstanding that, I've got the sense that for a little while, we've had a tipping point, both in terms of the impacts, but also a tipping point where communities, governments, and businesses are responding proactively to reduce impacts. In some cases with legislation, in other cases through community action and corporate action. So there's been a fair few announcements recently. So China came out as the biggest emitter now and set their net zero goal to 2060 just last month at the UN General Assembly in New York. China will aim to hit peak emissions before 2030 and aim for carbon neutrality by 2060. In Australia, you've got a number of super funds moving towards net zero. UniSuper, HESTA, and CBUS have committed to achieving net zero by 2050, and another 13 funds are actively looking to reduce their portfolio emissions intensity. And the banks have set emissions intensity targets. APRA has announced a stress test on the banks around climate risk. So the money is certainly moving towards net zero. And we'll come back to talking about how that plays into cities and decarbonisation. In Europe, UK announced that wind energy will power all homes from an electricity point of view in the next decade. While staying in Europe, the European Parliament also set an ambitious 60% emission reduction goal by 2030 as part of the European climate law. And in Ireland, as well as Japan, they've talked about getting to carbon neutrality in Ireland through a legally banned bill, and Japan announcing carbon neutrality by 2050. So there's quite a bit of momentum from the large emitters. And finally, to top it off, just in the last couple of weeks, the International Energy Agency, in its annual Energy Outlook report, declared solar energy as the new leader in electricity fuel. The report found that solar energy is already cheaper than power generated by new coal and gas developments in most countries, and providing some of the lowest cost electricity that IEA has seen. As well as that, the IEA found that thermal coal is now in structural decline. So in this context, cities and their decarbonisation process has commenced already. All states in Australia have net zero targets, some more ambitious than others, but all working towards the Paris goals. In addition, several cities globally have signed onto the Paris Agreement via the Climate Mayors Initiative. And the scale and the speed of the transition to recognizing that the scale and speed to achieve 1.5 is going to be extraordinary. We need to start reducing emissions globally by this year, halve emissions over the next 10 years, and get to net zero emissions by 2050. Some would say earlier, by 2040, to get to 1.5 degrees. This means reducing emissions by 7% every year. This year, we seem to have magically hit a similar number by COVID, but we're not going to have that from every year, or at least we hope we're not going to have that every year going forward. So we're going to achieve that sort of emission reduction where all travel is suspended and offices are not lit up for the next decade through to 2050. So these are ambitious reduction goals, and city decarbonisation is very much a central part of it, with buildings and energy needing to go to net zero by 2040 to achieve this goal. So I'm so glad to have a really great representation of actors in the field of decarbonising cities on the panel. So really looking forward to hearing from them. And I think probably the best way to get started is perhaps asking each of them to better introduce themselves in terms of their role and their background, but also their relationship to the city decarbonisation challenge. So I might start with yourself, Anna.
Thanks, Terence. So as Terence said before, my name is Anna Quillin and I'm the Director of Delivery for ENGIE in ANZ. And the team that I work for specifically is called the Better Cities team. ENGIE has a particular focus on cities because as we strive to sort of lead that transition to net zero, we need to focus on the areas that are going to get us the biggest bang for our buck. And if you look at cities, more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities. We take up less than 2% of the space in the globe. We consume over 75% of the energy globally, and we emit over 80% of the greenhouse gases. So if you're going to have an impact, let's start with the biggest users of energy. And when we look at cities and we try to help cities transform and take that drive to net zero, we focus on a couple of different areas. The first one is reducing the energy consumption. So I guess that's a great way to have a big impact. And secondly, to decarbonise the energy source. And then we also complement that, I guess, by looking at how a city operates and making it more attractive and sustainable to live in.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anna. Louise, if I might get you to go next.
Thanks, Terence. So Louise Munger, I'm the Vice President of Digital Buildings with Schneider Electric, and quite new to this role. I was recently working for AMP Capital in real estate investment portfolios and looking after real estate portfolios from a technology and property management perspective. At Schneider Electric, I think we're working towards an approach, a two-prong approach here. It's about electrifying buildings, so getting as much of the energy consumption as possible into electricity sources and away from fossil fuels. And then digitalising buildings, so making sure that we can digitise and control buildings to control the demand. So it's a two-pronged approach. There's a lot of scope, a big impact that can be had. I think buildings are responsible for some 40% of carbon emissions in cities. And therefore, by looking at both new and existing buildings, we can have a really big impact on carbon neutrality.
Thanks, Louise. Rob, how about yourself at Monash?
Thanks for having me. Rob Brimley, Manager Engineering and Sustainability at Monash. Monash, by its nature, one of the largest universities in Australia. We run basically small cities in full flight. Our campuses can take up to 50,000 people a day. That involves people travelling on Transdev buses to get to our campuses. It involves them operating in our buildings with controls from Schneider Electric, and right now ENGIE is our electricity provider, so it's all powered up from the electrons coming from the grid. So I guess within that context, we're on the journey to net zero. We've made a commitment by 2030 to operate our campuses as net zero, and that really means 100% renewable powered. On that journey to date, which my team oversees, we've built a whole bunch of buildings that fit the criteria as Louise described them. They're all electric, they're high efficiency. And really the next big push for us is to turn those buildings into dynamic assets that can start to interact with the grid and really start to play their active role in forming that renewable powered future. So that's the journey for us. And I guess as a university, we see our role as walking the talk, but also developing solutions that can then push out into the broader city and into the world to help others go on the path that we're on right now.
Great, thanks, Rob. And Mark, you've got a battery behind you.
Thanks, Terence. Yes, so I'm head of engineering for Transdev Australasia, and so I'm responsible for the 1700 bus assets across the major Australian cities, 3 on the eastern seaboard, obviously Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, to give some examples. Prior to joining Transdev, I started my climate change journey in Australia probably about 5 or 6 years ago, as a designer and manufacturer of electric vehicles, producing Australia's first electric bus. So my journey started prior to me joining Transdev, but now being responsible for our assets and being responsible for our e-mobility and introduction of zero emission buses into Australia is a fantastic opportunity for myself. But obviously my ambition is to make sure that we get rid of diesel emissions from the whole of Australia's fleet during my career prior to my retirement. But obviously as a public transport company, we are naturally engaged globally against global warming. This is our first point. We've got to build sustainable transport means, and obviously in amongst COVID, first and foremost, convincing people to get back on public transport and not use their cars is crucial. And then providing obviously zero emissions public transport to a high quality, and it's optimised and it's efficient to increase the patronage. Secondly, we're at the start of a journey in Australia. Certainly the technology is new to transition the fleets to green energies, hybrid, hydrogen, electric buses. But our efforts off the back of being the major European zero emissions mobility company, we're keen to build a position in Australia and New Zealand, and we've already introduced an e-bus into Melbourne, and we'll be doing so into Sydney and into Brisbane later at the beginning of next year. We're also introducing e-buses into New Zealand. But obviously the good thing from my perspective is we're a Parisian headquarters and global perspective company, and we can pull on best ideas, best practice and technologies. And as you touched on behind me, the Tesla Megawall, which is live right now here in Queensland, in the bus depot, producing renewable energy that will power Queensland's new e-bus when it joins our fleet next year. So as I say, my journey started earlier, prior to joining Transdev and producing Australia's first electric bus, but I very much look forward to going up against the fight against climate change and transforming our whole national fleet to e-mobility in the coming years.
Thank you, Mark. I've got mine going too on a sunny
Excellent
day in Melbourne. That's fabulous. And as I said, just coming back to the point that I think we've got some fabulous people on the panel who are tackling all aspects of city and decarbonisation. So I might start with a sort of a broader question, probably to Anna, in terms of working on a whole of city basis. Anna, what is the process for achieving net zero in a city? How does the city go about it? What are the practical steps? And do you have an example?
Thanks, Terence. Look, it's one of those questions. I mean, it's such a huge target to have, isn't it, to get to net zero? When you think about it, we could probably all go out there and organise a green PPA and buy some carbon credits. But if every company or country or city did that, we wouldn't have enough to go around. So there really does need to be a focus around changing the infrastructure that the city uses. The first step, I think, and I have an engineering background, so the first step in any major project is to have a plan. You know, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So it's all about really building an assessment of where you sit today in terms of your energy usage, where it's coming from, what it's being used on, and then mapping out a roadmap to achieve your net zero goals. So we do have a number of techniques and tools in-house to do that, and I know that there are many companies that do as well, but I think that is an absolute critical step, is to build that roadmap to the final transition. So what does that mean in terms of where your energy is coming from? Is it coming from, you know, locally generated solar or wind? Are you purchasing PPAs, etc.? Are you changing the infrastructure for your heating and cooling systems, for example, to get better energy efficiencies? And then tackling problems, you know, as Louise alluded to, about how we operate our buildings and how do we make them smarter and more efficient. So the roadmap is really the first step. You also, I suppose, in that roadmap process, you really need to consider how you measure and track your journey as well, because I guess you can put in and implement a number of changes, but unless you're tracking how you're going, you're really not getting a good view of how far off you are from your target. The other important thing to note is that there's no one solution. Every city, and when we speak about cities, we don't necessarily mean Melbourne or Brisbane or Sydney. We might mean a university precinct, as Rob alluded to, or a hospital, a military base, a port, a train station, you know, anything that has a number of buildings with complex energy needs. So any of those precincts, you know, I guess all have very different challenges, and they operate in different ways. So there is no one solution, there is no one size fits all. It takes a lot of different technologies, a lot of different solutions, a lot of different approaches. So you need someone in there to be able to integrate all of that together and have that sort of broad, high level vision. We do have, I guess, a good example, a working in progress example in Australia, which is a long-term partnership that we have with Springfield City Group, just outside of Brisbane. They have a target to achieve net zero by 2038. So they gave themselves 20 years. That target was set almost 2 years ago now. That population is growing. It's 40,000 people today, and planning to be 130,000 by the time they achieve their net zero target. So not only are they trying to achieve this amazing target, but they're also doing it while the city grows and develops. So definitely a work in progress, but the first critical step was that development of the roadmap.
Great. Thanks, Anna. I might pose a question to Louise in terms of the buildings themselves. So Anna talked about cities, but buildings being a large part of cities. What are the considerations when it comes to decarbonisation of buildings from your work and Schneider's point of view?
Yeah, so I touched on this before, but you know, the pathway to zero carbon will require buildings to be optimised. So firstly, they need to be made more efficient. There's a whole range of technologies that already exist that can do that. They need to be electrified. So as I said, shifting that demand from to electricity away from fossil fuels and gases, and then decarbonise, so using zero carbon technologies to generate electricity. I think the catch is that all of those things exist. They all exist, the technologies are there, that can all be provided, but it really comes back to the challenge of aligning intent between all of the stakeholders that are involved in cities. And you know, even just with buildings, you've got government regulation, you've got owners, you've got occupiers, visitors, commuters, tenants, retailers. So how do you actually, you know, align intent to achieve that outcome? And it's really only when everybody's working together and agrees that they're trying to achieve an outcome, I think you can get momentum in the right direction. Otherwise, you get a piecemeal approach to that, and it's going to take a long time to get to true carbon neutrality. But I think, you know, if we look at Anna's example and a whole city approach, there's obviously a great aligned intent there, right from a planning perspective, to achieve that outcome. So it poses something challenge when you look at a city. CBD, lots of buildings, some old, some new. How do you actually start chipping away at all of those existing assets to achieve that outcome?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. So if we then talk about buildings, now there's old buildings at Monash and there's new ones coming up, and I know I've been involved with sign off of Monash's greenhouse emissions and so on, so I know a little bit about your emission sources there, Rob. How do you tackle, what's the approach in net zero emissions, you know, how they're different when it comes to old and new buildings in your experience?
Yeah, well, obviously the outcome is just the same as Louise has outlined, and we've been privileged over the last 5 years to take on this challenge. And I think, you know, again, it's one of those sort of national challenges for us. How do we change the sector? And I'm going to be cheeky and say that new buildings are easy in terms of you design them well, you build them well, and you design out most of the demand for fossil fuels. Some of our buildings don't use heating anymore in Melbourne's frigid climate, but most of them still need a little bit of top up. But it's very easy to do that with your high efficiency heat pumps when you've got a good envelope. It takes your heating and cooling demands right down. So we've now got 5 buildings that are, you know, designed to be all electric. These range from small office to residential to office to large teaching spaces, which we've just completed on our campus over the last year. So for us, that barrier for new buildings is not there. And pleasingly, we've seen the GBCA with their future focus come to the party here, and they're launching, I believe this week, their new standard. And really they're looking for 5- and 6-star buildings to either be on the pathway or to be at net zero emissions by 2030. So they've recognised that this should be the new normal as well, which is great. As we've alluded to, the big challenge is the existing stock. It's very hard to intervene in fabric in existing buildings, incredibly expensive, incredibly disruptive. So we're looking at these broader strategies of infrastructure, how you start to bring the infrastructure to bear to help us transition these buildings. For us, it's really looking at that sort of more centralised plant, that high efficiency, how we start investing in pulling out the gas infrastructure, which we're on the pathway to, but providing these buildings with the hot and cold water that they need to function using the best in breed infrastructure. Obviously, the challenges that come with that are that the buildings weren't designed necessarily for this technology. The easy example is that our campus runs on a high temperature hot water loop, very high temperature water by a gas boiler. Our buildings are expecting that water, that high temperature to do the peak heating and cooling. So shifting that to a heat pump technology, which is super efficient, but generates more in the sort of 60 to 70 temperature water rather than the 150, which our loop runs on, is a technical challenge. It's one that we've proven that you can take on, but it does, to Anna's point, it needs that forward planning. You need to have an investment cycle. You need to have a technological roadmap in place. And frankly, in our current horizon, you also need to have some innovative finance mechanisms to help you go on that journey.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. And I guess the other big emission source in cities, not forgetting transport, Mark. So in your experience, based on what you're doing and what you're seeing, can you talk a little bit about the emerging and new innovation in fuel sources in terms of decarbonising the transport part of city infrastructure?
So in our major cities, obviously our fleets are predominantly diesel at the moment. There is hybrid vehicles and obviously biodiesels, etc., available also. But obviously the big shift will be e-mobility and electric buses. And that's the beginning of it in Australia. We've got a handful of electric buses around the country. Hydrogen certainly will have its position and its place in the technology roadmap, to quote Anna. It's much earlier in its technology, but again, it's one size doesn't fit all. And data, to Anna's point as well, is very important for us to start to target what our actual requirement is. We see here in Brisbane, we've managed to sort of decarbonise the maintenance structure using the existing building, and we've not had to do too much of changes. You know, it's a relatively new facility. So again, to Rob's point, it's been a reasonable transition. But mapping out exactly what the requirement of energy within our cities around our network is so important to be able to make those decisions. And obviously, as I say, this at the moment, electric buses with an electric battery seems to be the solution, and being able to power that with renewable energy Like we've got what we're producing here live in the depot, we've got enough energy here to produce a couple of e-buses, and we plan to expand that later next year. And it does make you have a look at your infrastructure, and you have to plan ahead. You can't, it's like everything else, we've already got a whole host of assets. We can't just get rid of them and replace them overnight. So there's going to be a transition, there is a plan, and there is a replacement schedule. But you must think ahead for your infrastructure and what you're requiring as you add more and more buses into and what you require from the grid. So for us, it's really exciting from that perspective that we can see the solar technology as well that's available for storage. And even now, we know there's a convergence of technology. The change in solar panels is already, we're about to move from a 400 watt panel to a 464 watt panel. We've only had it this operating for 60 days. So the technology is jumping away ahead. So you have to make sure that you're adjusting your roadmap and your technology roadmap to match what's coming ahead and have that foresight. So it's just generally, we look at the industry at the moment, probably the space race is probably the most exciting thing that's catching people's minds at the moment, the journey to Mars. But I would say our sector and e-mobility is got to be the second most exciting in the world, to have this opportunity. And like I said, for myself, a generation thing, I've got potential, I could make a real difference going forward in the next 25 years.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So hopefully you're retiring before 2040 and you'll have it all sorted by then. I might come back to Anna and Mark. You mentioned hydrogen, and then I might come back to you, Mark, to elaborate on hydrogen. I think you gave us a bit on the electric side. Anna, can you talk about the role of hydrogen in decarbonising cities and mobility based on your experience and what you're seeing from ONG's work globally?
Yeah, thanks, Terence. And just to Mark's point just before, I think who needs to travel to Mars when you're changing the world? I think what we're doing is actually the most exciting thing going on at the moment, and hydrogen is definitely at the forefront. I don't think you can open a newspaper these days, or at least scroll through one, without seeing the words hydrogen. We've got roadmaps in place, we've got funding in place at state and federal government level, and it's definitely an exciting technology, and it's one that obviously has been around for a long time. It does need a lot of work to make it commercial. It is not commercial today, but the opportunity is there to really drive great change. And I think as sort of Rob and Louise spoke to, around buildings and the challenge with electrifying existing building stock is where we're going to see a need for decarbonised gas, a gas source. So certainly our experience in Europe is electrification of existing cities is hard. As Rob said, it is hard, it is very expensive, and it takes a long time. So for existing building stock, I think hydrogen really does come into its own, and equally into the transport industry. At the moment, when we look at injection into networks, we know that we can only achieve about 10% today of hydrogen injection. So we do need to look at complementing the existing gas network with other gas sources, biomethane, etc., to help decarbonise that whole network. But hydrogen, I think, will play a really key role. And when we look at transport, as Mark alluded to, buses are in that funny position where they could either run off electricity or gas. We tend to say that hydrogen will replace traditional heavy vehicles, things that are run on diesel today, so trains and trucks and heavy vehicles, and electricity or EVs will really replace the smaller vehicles, so our cars and and small vehicles, and buses sit in that funny position where they can be run on either. At the moment, it's more economical to build an EV, but I think we will see more and more hydrogen vehicles, hydrogen buses being built in the future. And I think one of the great things about the hydrogen industry in Australia is that we do have a great opportunity to build that industry here, which in turn helps our cities to be more resilient and our economy to be more resilient. So I think there's really wonderful opportunity, and I think there's a space for lots of different technologies in this race to get to net zero.
Is hydrogen Anna still part of the mix for Springfield?
Yes, we're looking at a trial hydrogen buses actually. With Springfield, and so that will definitely be on the cards there.
Okay, great, thanks. That's a good segue into Mark, your sort of take on hydrogen and particularly in the mobility space, how that's evolving globally and here.
So Transdev globally, we have hydrogen buses in our world fleet, and Transdev Australasia will introduce a hydrogen vehicle towards the end of this year. So watch that space. And to Anna's earlier point, it is in its infancy, you know, it's early as far as infrastructure, but it's really important for us to start collecting the data, you know, the telematics and the safety side of it that will be connected to the hydrogen vehicle will allow us to make an assessment specifically. Again, one size doesn't fit all, so we have to actually see how Australia performs, and temperature is obviously high on the list. But again, to Anna's point, an e-bus and a hydrogen bus are very similar to each other. They're 80–90% of the technology is the same, but obviously the final fuel being hydrogen. And it's interesting from a bus perspective that we've come historically, we can see CNG buses that have been all the in vogue, I suppose, you know, probably 15, 20, 25 years ago, of which we run and we operate a fleet in Perth. That technology and infrastructure looks as if it potentially, you know, may be able to be retrofitted and joined with hydrogen. So there is, although it seems like it's a brand new product, we're already operating buses with CNG. So really, it's a convergence and a change to hydrogen. But certainly, everything has its advantages and disadvantages. But me personally, as chief engineer, I'd like to see rubber on the ground and collect the data before we make any final decisions. But certainly in Australia's tents, there is plenty of opportunity, and we're constantly being approached to produce or to help people who are producing hydrogen to actually be a user of it. And certainly it has its place, and it certainly gives you a range extension compared to electric battery buses. So and I agree that it fits in that space, you know, trucks and other modes of transport that are longer in their distance. The hydrogen could just be that, you know, that little niche, and it could fit in that space very, very well. So, but again, it's the delivery of the hydrogen to site. At the moment, we can deliver electricity or renewable energy quite easily. So that's the secret. But again, building it into new builds and new infrastructure, it's just about planning. So yeah, again, it's exciting times, and Australia has an abundance of these resources available.
Is it too early, Mark, to talk about or see which one might win out between electric and hydrogen, particularly in the bus sort of space?
Look, I think, yeah, I would say that, you know, you think about in 10 years' time, there's a potential there that a battery itself will have doubled its range in 10 years' time. So really, where does hydrogen sit as far as that range? So have batteries caught up? Can we do the same range as hydrogen? Have we got the difficulties of delivering? So it's just, again, it's technology's moving. We just have to make sure we invest and we try it and we have a go, basically, and that's the exciting part. But again, for Transdev and for myself, having a fleet of 800 e-buses in Europe or globally, and that will be pushed on to nearly 1,100 e-mobility vehicles by the end of next year, allows us to pull the data much earlier and make the decisions and make the right decisions that take us forward.
Yeah, great. Louise, I might come back to the question I asked Rob about existing buildings and, you know, one of the interventions being digitizing the buildings so that you can measure and intervene as you need. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, how digitizing buildings fits in the decarbonising city model and what you do in that space?
And I mean, it's so critical to convert that opportunity of existing buildings and digitising existing buildings if we're going to nail this. So if we think about that building of the future, so an upgraded building, a retrofit or digitise existing building, it's going to be more sustainable and energy efficient. It's going to be hyper efficient in the way that it can actually operate. So through digitising the systems and connecting systems and sensors, we're actually going to be able to manage buildings far more efficiently. So what does that mean? That means that we might be doing maintenance on demand instead of by routine. In turn, that's going to mean we're only sending technicians and trades to buildings as and when required rather than by routine. We may only be cleaning on demand because we've got the sensing technology to tell us when to clean, and so on and so forth. So by doing that, we're actually going to be able to reduce those services and make them more efficient and more on time. That's going to improve customer experience, but it's also going to lower the footprint, the operational footprint of those buildings. So that efficiency piece in terms of connecting and digitising building systems and being able to you know, anticipate when a building needs something and reacting to that is really important. Of course, the fabulous benefit of that is that we're then creating buildings that are more human-centred, they are more comfortable, they've got better use cases for health and well-being, which is really important to customers now and building occupants, and they're going to be more resilient for, you know, things like pandemics or climate change or other things that come in the future. So through that digitisation, these are some of the benefits that we'll see. I think that's a really strong message to get through to portfolio owners, many of who are actually setting their own targets. They're not waiting for government targets, they're competing for the green dollar in terms of investors. I think you mentioned some investors at the start who are have some very clear remits around how they're spending their money. So we're seeing some of the large office funds, as an example, in Australia set really clear targets to be carbon neutral by as early as 2025 or sooner. So they're actually driving it themselves, and that will be a flow-on effect from setting those targets amongst those investors as well.
So Louise, just on digitising, is it a mix of hardwiring as well as plug and play and sort of Wi-Fi enabled devices?
Sensors, overlaying sensors to existing technologies, integrations through multiple previously disparate systems, and really creating that Internet of Things network in order to control workflows. So it might be taking, you know, traditional feeds from your BMS and your air conditioning, but overlaying sensing technology in meeting rooms, as an example, to drive air conditioning on demand, to drive cleaning on demand, to turn air conditioning off if rooms aren't being used, and to start to anticipate that. But I think absolutely the maintenance on demand by using a whole range of data sets from a number of systems will be a big game changer, because if you look at maintenance sectors, you know, across most industries currently in capital cities, they're still done by planned preventative maintenance, sending technicians to look at service equipment that may or may not need servicing on that date. It's just part of their routine. So if we can actually start using the data to tell us when to go and service something, then that will be, you know, a big operational efficiency.
Great, thanks. Rob, what I might get you to do is comment a little bit on, I guess, the digitising question and what you've done in the existing building space versus what you've done in the new buildings, because you've had the, I guess, foresight to be able to plan these in. And then comment a little bit on the financial opportunities available and the things that you've done. I know I've been involved in some of the green bond work, but it'd be good to first hear about the digitising and then the finance work that you've done in the green finance space.
Yeah, great. And I think, as you know, given the work you've done for us, that they go hand in hand in terms of good data makes for better financing, and the better your data, the better your financing. So it's certainly the path we're on. Some of the new builds, and one that is recently completed, the one of our teaching and learning buildings, two of our teaching and learning buildings actually, that uses Schneider control systems. It's looking to how you bring this data, and as Louise said, how you make the data interoperable, how you bring the systems together. And Louise, mentioned the IoT, the Internet of Things. When the university talks about we need an IoT platform, we kind of sheepishly put our hands up and said, you've got one. It's your buildings and all the control technology that's inside them. So this is where we can bring our buildings to life in terms of dynamically. And I think the most recent example of this is we again, somewhat sheepishly had an always on policy for our buildings. We had students streaming in and out in a very predictable manner every day. So our buildings needed to be on, they needed to be available. We did some recent analysis with ENGIE looking at our energy performance against our Wi-Fi data. And you see this wonderful correlation through the mid-semester or the mid-year exam period, where Wi-Fi and occupancy correlate beautifully with energy consumption. And then we went back into shutdown, and here's a building that's running almost full energy with next to no one in it. And it's this very tricky balance. We didn't design our control strategies to be partially occupied. We designed them to be available because they always were, and they always needed to be. So the big opportunity for us is, how do we bring these new technologies of machine learning and AI to the forefront? How do we feed them the data that's previously been constrained in our systems, to allow them to guide us, to allow us to run 160 buildings rather than one building? Because this is the scale, and this is the challenge for cities, that it's huge data, and data beyond Excel, data beyond the individual human. But we have these new tools that can handle that data, and it's what it's designed to do. But the challenge we're finding at the moment is, how do you plug the data into these tools? And there's some really great progress being made, and I think that's a really exciting opportunity. And drawing it back to the finance piece, that if we have that data alive and we're servicing our buildings, and Louise talked about this predictive maintenance, for us, using our maintenance dollar to uplift our assets is absolutely what we want to do. We don't want to be spending money on reactive repairs. We want to be investing that maintenance dollar, that OPEX that is so precious, into uplifting the assets. And then with that data, we can start to guide our CapEx investment too, because you use that data to say, this pump has been there for 50 years, but it's still running really well. It's reliable, it's still efficient. The one we put in last year on the fly because we had to, was a reactive maintenance. It's not operating well, it's not reliable, it's not efficient. That's the one we should prioritize. That's the one that we should be investing in. It's a simple example, but this is where we want to bring the OPEX and the CapEx together to help us drive that investment. You touched on some of our climate bonds. One of the great outcomes of developing in net zero buildings is that we've been able to access new capital markets. Certainly sustainable investment is a huge pool of investment looking for a long-term stable asset to invest in. So because we had this high level of performance in our buildings, we basically were able to say, well, invest in our buildings, which is a wonderful opportunity for an asset-heavy organisation such as Monash to be able to do. And certainly the other instruments, financial instruments we're seeing in the market now, with the economies of scale of renewables, being able to look into that corporate renewable energy space and directly choose where our energy comes from, and in doing so, make the cost of energy lower. So it's not just that we're committed to net zero emissions, that we're committed to financial stability. And through good data, through good integration, it's allowing us to deliver better outcomes for our business, which just reinforces and accelerates our transition. Having climate bond certified buildings is good for our business, so we keep building these buildings. Having renewable energy powering our campus is good for our businesses, so we keep buying renewable energy. It's a virtuous cycle. It is really pleasing to see.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. Just beyond sort of financing, how's payback sort of considered by institutions? I might also ask Anna, from a Springfield point of view, what sort of payback is being sought by the CFO when you talk about interventions and new technologies?
Do you want to start that one, Anna? Or?
You go for it, Rob.
I guess, again, it's recognizing that energy is fundamental to operating our businesses, and that you've got to have good infrastructure, reliable energy to have a reliable business. Louise touched on it. Comfort, quality in our buildings is at the forefront. We built net zero buildings because it's the right thing to do for the planet, but the primary driver, the reason the business case got up, was because we build buildings for people to think, to be creative, and to frankly learn and do innovation. So if we're providing assets that aren't meeting that requirement, it's not good for our business. It's not good for our future students. It's not good for our broader economy. So when those things come together hand in hand, the payback becomes that you can generate a more sustainable business model. And the upside is that you eliminate the emissions as almost an externality or a benefit that comes along with it. It's never that simple, but it's certainly the driver is, what's the purpose of these spaces and how do we make them great for people to exist in? And turns out that energy efficiency and renewable energy tick both of those boxes. So that's been the primary driver for our business case on this.
Yeah, and I think I'd agree with those comments. Certainly, in the case of Springfield, we're not investing heavily in hydrogen at the moment because it's not commercial, and it would cost significantly more to run the city on hydrogen than it would on solar, for example. So that isn't a commercial case yet. But when you look holistically at the problem, and you don't just look at the cost of energy, you look at the cost of not delivering a green solution, you look at the cost of carbon. I think that certainly does come into the equation now, and I think certainly the examples that universities are setting, and even large corporates, I think any large corporate these days, if you take the simple look, any large corporate these days that doesn't really have a sustainability strategy, that isn't committed to this target, won't attract the best talent in the market. So it actually becomes a larger business proposition. It's not just about the cost of your energy anymore. It's about the wider problem that exists there. So I think it's definitely being viewed differently. The same lens always applies, that cost is important, but I think there are other aspects that come into the equation that certainly didn't before.
Great. So I might go around the panel just to ask about challenges, and just briefly, what are you seeing as the sort of biggest barriers or challenges in the work that you do? So when you do walk into a Springfield opportunity or the next Springfield opportunity, or when you look at converting fleets over, Mark, what are the challenges that you're coming across in the decarbonising pathway? So I might go with Anna, Rob, Mark and Louise in that order.
I think, look, some of the challenges are the new technology that isn't commonly sort of used in Australia, or infrastructure. If we think about district heating and cooling networks that are prevalent throughout Europe, the US, Canada, and even parts of Asia now. In Australia, they're not very, very common. So this idea of paying for utilities as a service, so chilled water as a service, hot water as a service, rather than every building throwing a couple of chillers and a cooling tower on their roof, integrating into a wider network, and perhaps using the space on their roof to put some solar panels up. That is quite a new concept in Australia, and so there are challenges sort of, I guess, negotiating the legal aspects of that, the financial aspects of that, and the human nature of people, traditionally owning their own infrastructure and managing it themselves, to then sort of relinquishing that to someone else. So that's a challenge that we're finding, but definitely making some great inroads there, and hopefully we'll have some great projects to demonstrate that in the coming years.
Rob?
Yes, I think building off that Anna touched on in her previous answer, that value stack, the integration and the holistic view of the business and your ability to generate revenue, it requires some pretty solid system thinking, and cities are large systems, really the most complicated systems that we've created, and campuses are no different. So having that bigger picture view of it and having that longer term plan is probably the biggest challenge for us. we're lucky as long-term organisations, as institutions within a stable economy, that we can start to do that longer-term planning. But you need good partnership from industry to help guide that, because we can't do that thinking on our own. We do our own thinking and our own research, but how it integrates with the market and with the industry is a big challenge, and working together is the only way to get there, is what we see it as.
Mark?
A big challenge for us, obviously, from a transport perspective, and being a global leader is obviously our jobs to educate and support. And obviously, people, when any new technology, people see a certain amount of risk, and certainly if it's been so expensive compared to a standard diesel bus, people are a little bit reluctant at times. So it's been able to share that experience with them, that we've been operating for many years globally. And here's the results: it's economically viable that you can operate an electric bus or a hydrogen bus from a maintenance cost and energy cost. But as I said earlier, I think, again, for public transport, getting people onto buses and onto trains and onto ferries for Transdev in Australia, and getting people out of cars and into their sites is obviously a big challenge as well. And obviously it puts more requirement for the public transport to be perfect, and be correct. And again, I'm a data guy, and I'll look at the one bus that we introduced into Melbourne in 2019, and it's reduced obviously 50 tonnes of CO2, just one bus over 35,000 kilometres. And again, it's that education piece. And trying to let people know that let's invest in this area, and we'll get this reduction target we need, but we just need everybody, and it's a collaborative thing. To Rob's point, it's everybody in society has got a part to play, not just us providing the bus. So yeah, there's challenges ahead, but challenges are good, and it's exciting.
Thanks, Mark. Louise?
Yeah, from a real estate perspective, I think one of the big challenges is long development cycles and how rapidly technology is changing compared to when decisions need to be locked in for new developments and precinct developments and infrastructure. So, coming from the owner's side and developer's side, we were often forced to make decisions with the builder some 3 or 4 years out, knowing that technology is actually changing potentially twice in that cycle, in that time frame. So, a big challenge for the industry is how we can build more flexibility into decision making, future-proofing decisions early in the development cycle, so that we can get maximum benefit in those decisions as close as possible to opening a building. Again, that's something that's going to take strong intent from everyone in that cycle, that building cycle.
Fabulous, thanks. I think you're all very much practical people who are working a way to change the world, and it's great to hear from you. But you haven't. It's interesting that you haven't mentioned the politics and the noise that the politicians create as a challenge, because for me that continues to create a lot of noise, unnecessary noise, of protecting the industries that are dying away, both here and in the US, unfortunately, at the moment. But thank you again, Anna, Rob, Mark, and Louise, for a really insightful session and taking time out of your day to join us here. I'd also like to again thank the French-Australian Chamber of Commerce, Schneider, and the French Embassy, Austrade, and sponsors for their support. Also, there's a 15-minute live Q&A right after this session, so please join us for that. Thank you.
Thank you.